Content Podcast, episode 166. Musician and cultural theorist David Maggs.
What you do as an artist is crucial. Do not abandon that for a desire to serve a kind of utilitarian purpose of I'm going to make sure people know more. The faith in knowing more is the siren song of our society that constantly sees us leaping off of the vessel that can carry us through this, with this belief that we can suddenly transform society because we can provide information. Decorating climate policy with the arts is not transformative. What you know how to do as an artist is so fundamentally important.
David Maggs defines his work as an attempt to integrate the core capacities of the arts with larger social challenges: sustainability, health, social justice, community development, and so on. David grew up in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, and spent much of his development years as a classical pianist. As did I, for that matter. I was studying piano and clarinet in North Bay, Ontario. David has done many things in his life, including in 2002 founding the Gross Mourne Summer Music, now called Camber Arts, and is very active in cultural production and cultural theory. My first conversation with David was in episode 30, Art in the World After This, recorded during an outdoors COVID-era walk on March 25th, 2021 in Vancouver. And we talked about artistic capacity, sustainability, value propositions, disruption, recovery, and a paper he had just written, Art and the World After This. Conscient Podcast, it's March 25th, 2021, and I'm with David Maggs in Vancouver, and we're having a socially distanced conversation, or at least an outdoor one. So, David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
It's the first recording I'm doing of the season. I'm going to actually publish it later because you have a paper coming out in April. But I wanted to take the opportunity to have a conversation with you because that's what this season is about, talking with thought leaders and people who are working in and around arts and culture, but also on the issues that I'm interested in, which is the notion of reality, which we could talk a lot about, and also working through ecological grief. Now, since then, David has become a Metcalf Fellow on Arts and Society at the Metcalf Foundation in Toronto, where he nurtures and supports the desire in Canada's arts sector to move with and shape ongoing patterns of transformative societal change. And you'll understand in a minute what he means by these words. Now, David and I were co-founders of SCALE, Sectoral Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency, along with Anjali Appadurai, Anthony Garofalo-Sauger, Kendra Fanconi, Judy Pearl, and Robin Sokolowski, followed by many others, but those were the founding 7 in 2021. And David and I have been corresponding ever since about art and climate and sound and music and the environment. And in fact, on March 16th, 2024, I posted a Calm Presence newsletter item called David Maggs' Art and the Climate Emergency. That's an example of the kind of exchanges we've had. So when it came to this second conversation, the focus was on being and transformation. And I'll give you a sample.
And my argument is that we are intuiting the ability of art to work at the level of being, to engage with transformative change in the way that I've described. But what happens is we live in a culture that is so structured around problem solving at the level of information and knowledge that as soon as we think, okay, yes, of course, art has something really important to do with this, we then immediately, instead of allowing the arts to pull climate discourse into the realm of being, climate discourse pulls art into the realm of knowing. And it becomes a tool for knowing rather than something that allows us to start to engage with ourselves at the level of being.
So there's lots here. There's about an hour conversation, so you might want to listen to it in chunks or um, take the time to sit down with David and I and think about some of these issues. For example, he talks about the cultural gap in the climate emergency, which he defines as the difference between the imperative of transformation at the level of being and a particular society's capacity to do so. Ours is really low. So that really struck me, the notion of a cultural gap and how our focus is on trying to sound the alarm, provide more information, more knowledge like we've done for the last 200 years. That doesn't seem to be working very well. But the experience of being, the experience of art making and artistic appreciation and impact, those are the things that David is passionate about, and I'm with him on that. There is a sense that we can turn things around from information into being. Hey, David, it's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too, Claude. Thanks for having me on.
Too bad we couldn't do this in person because, but Zoom is the second best, and we're all used to it now. David, I'm happy to have you back on Conscient because the last time we spoke was on May 25th, 2021 in Vancouver. We went for a walk and we talked about all kinds of things, including the paper you had just published at the time, Art in the World After This. And of course, you've written a lot since then. And we've been involved, and we're both left the organization called Scale, but we started a number of things that are in and around climate, art, culture, and I appreciate taking the time to have a second conversation because now those who are interested can go to hear the first. It's episode 30. And what has happened in the last 3 years, of course, we can't cover all that ground, but we can talk about the things that are important to you now. We just talked about impact investment a few seconds ago before we started recording. And you also published a really important paper called Art and the Climate Crisis that I commented upon, and you and I have been exchanging about. And I just want to share some of those thoughts with our listeners because you're somebody who has a unique position, having a PhD in the sciences as well as an arts background. That's a really interesting perspective to comment and critique and move forward some of our issues. But let's start. Those that don't know you, David Maggs, just a quick background.
Sure, thank you. So from the arts perspective, I sort of grew up in the classical music world, hacking away at the piano for many years in that wonderful world, and hit the if it's not a wall, it was certainly a real uphill slog of industry decline that came to Canada primarily through the changes to the CBC in 2008. And started to rethink my future relative to how robust that industry was going to be in the future. And I think a lot of my questions around what art is for really stemmed from the fact that the changes to the possibilities of making one's life in classical music promoted a lot of deep reflection in me in terms of saying, well, what is the good of this then? What is all of this for? And the response, the anger to those changes in 2008 was primarily a kind of moral response, like Canada or people won't be good people if they don't have Mozart in their lives. And I just felt so weirded out by that approach. I thought if we can't come up with better arguments for why the arts are important, then we're all in trouble, not just the classical musicians. So that's sort of where my arts trajectory went at the time. And then, an ongoing concern, interest about the the health of the planet turned into something much more explicit. I mean, I was the same as everybody else, I was enchanted by David Suzuki's work, and I had a Save the Whales t-shirt when it was, important to save the whales and such. But it sparked into a much deeper interest, and I went and did a PhD, as you say, at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia. And I got to work with a man named John Robinson, who was very big in the climate world at the time, one of the lead authors at the IPCC. And John has such a unique way of thinking about the climate crisis, because most environmentalism has a kind of heavily modernist perspective that the planet can be described by science and we can turn it into an absolute natural object that we can define. And John has a very different approach to this, and one that was really conducive to what an arts perspective can offer, thinking about planetary decline.
And of course, you've been um, working on with community. One of your um, positions right now is with the Metcalf Foundation, and that's where the blog or your essays are published. There's a lot we can cover, David, but I'm interested in particular because the mandate of this podcast around art and the ecological crisis, which includes the climate crisis, but as you know, is much larger. Maybe tell us about what you've been doing recently, what you're passionate about, and then we will inevitably talk about the essay because I have some questions for you. Those who have read it, and I really encourage people to read it and read it more than once because it's really rich and finely worded. You really took the time to try to transmit knowledge and knowings, not just knowledge. But yeah, what's on your mind these days?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what you identify that somewhat unique perspective of having both a fairly rigorous training in the sciences side of global change and the ecological crisis, and having a kind of active practice as an artist. And what that was able to do for me was not just to try and define the value from a supply side perspective. Art can do this or art can do that, but also try and understand the issue from a demand side perspective. What is it about the climate crisis that needs the things that art can do? And so I think really what I've been trying to do for the past 15 years is come up with better and better ways of identifying both sides of the relationship. And that is really what led me to the Metcalf Foundation, because what I've been doing largely there for the past 5 years is working with the Metcalf Foundation on bringing a lot of the ideas and principles and things you learn about and that everyone is fairly well versed in the sustainability world around transformative change and change making, to questions of cultural policy and the way in which the cultural sector can start to engage with its future in more proactive and innovative, and I would argue transformative ways. So that's the sort of basic sense of what my mandate is with the Metcalf Foundation. It's an absolutely wonderful opportunity. The title is Fellow on Art and Society. So it's an attempt to try and think about both of those aspects and the relationship that connects them. And I've been doing that across essentially a basic agenda around status quo is not okay for a variety of different reasons. And we have to figure out how to work with ourselves as a sector, a very unique cultural sector that is heavily publicly funded and sort of sits within a kind of nonprofit model for the most part in Canada. What does it mean to create innovation and change and start to respond to the moment that we're in more proactively than I think we tend to as a sector? We're a fairly historically grounded and nostalgia-driven uh, bunch of creatives. And so trying to think about certainly respond to and respect the values that are in history and nostalgia, with an appetite for making sure that those values can survive in a world that's very different than the one in which they emerged.
And I appreciate that because I've been thinking about societal collapse, or the imminent or the signs of that, and how it's happened in the past, and how we can adapt to realities, and then you know, survive literally to the next phase of human life. And I know that art has always been important in that, and I see it active now, but I don't see um, enough of it. And it's not that we need more climate art. Your paper is quite. It's almost funny, David, because you used the Bill McKibben quote about, how he was calling for more art, but then a lot of people suggested well-meaning art, but not necessarily good art. So tell me about good art and climate. Where are you coming from? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's so easy to make enemies with this kind of distinction. But this was fortuitous. And actually, Claude, it's funny to think about that because I came across that quote back when you were starting some of the art and ecology stuff at the council.
Mhm.
And I think you commissioned Beth Carruthers to do some work around that initiative. So I'm just realizing that now, actually,
Well, that was
that this,
2006 with Canadian
yeah,
Commission for UNESCO and Vancouver
that's right.
Foundation. Yeah, yeah. I'll put
And
that in
that's
the
that's where
episode notes.
oh, did you?
I
Okay.
will, so that people can
Oh,
refer back to it.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So Beth Carruthers and I encountered both of you for the first time, and this quote, and I thought, oh my God, this is it, right? Here's one of the most notable climate activists calling out for art and saying, art, we're so necessary. You need the arts. Why aren't the arts involved? And then having the chance to ask just in a kind of question period, when I heard McKibben speak about, it's 6 years later, what happened? Did you get the art? And the answer was, I mean, he didn't say it in this way, but for our purposes, I think it's fair to sort of to interpret him in this fashion to say, yeah, I got the art, but I didn't get what I was looking for from the art. And so a lot of the work that I've been trying to do is to parse that out. What is the difference between, just getting the art and getting the thing that even somebody like Bill McKibben, who's not an artist, knows he needs from the arts? What's the difference there, and how do we make sure that as we start to mobilize as a sector, we're not just providing huge amounts of stuff that nobody needs, and we are really trying to optimize for what is so crucially missing and that the arts are so uniquely adept at providing in this crisis.
So societal need, but not necessarily didactic or instrumentalized art, right? Because you've always been a proponent of good quality art. And I want to use good. I use it in in parentheses because there's no such thing as perfectly good art. But the paper, Art and the Climate Crisis, talks about symbolic infrastructure, and that's one of the concepts that excited me because I hadn't heard it before. Your thinking has evolved, over the years, and maybe you've used it before, but for me, it really kind of crystallizes in that idea. I think that's one of the main points of the paper. So what is that?
Yeah. Um, so, as you say, the sort of immediate, I think this goes back to, the water that we're swimming in from a Western point of view, which is so related to the relationship between a kind of Western worldview and the current circumstances of anthropogenic global change, of things like the climate crisis, has to do with the fact that the West optimized for information and knowledge. That's one way of kind of caricaturizing Western rationality. That in the end, the forces of Western materialism and a kind of Enlightenment approach to knowledge had a very explicit agenda to get rid of cultural practices that were built around belief and value and meaning and purpose and a sense of time and place, very deep anchoring aspects of ourselves. There was a kind of excavation, I think, that took place in favor of a notion of truth, right? Let's not do what our grandmother thinks. Let's find out what's actually going on. And so this is an approach to right information built around the faith that um, proper or correct knowledge produces correct behavior. And that has worked handsomely in so many different contexts. And I will always want to visit a dentist who has been trained in that worldview. And I'll always want to get on airplanes that have been built by people with that worldview. But it's at the same time cost us immeasurably. And the cost that I see in that is the ability to work on ourselves at what I've described in that paper and elsewhere at the level of being. And when you say, work on ourselves at the level of being, like what on earth does that mean? And I start by trying to identify things, the sort of the sense of being as a kind of composite entity comprised of things like meaning and identity and value and belief and belonging and purpose and time and place. People say, for example, like time, like what is time relative to a concept like being? And the way that I illustrate that is to think about the one that gets me all the time is sort of, it's early December and the first bit of snow starts to fall where I am. And I immediately have all kinds of existential expectations of myself. It's time at that point to start putting lights around my house, cut down a tree and bring it into the living room, buy a turkey, all of these strange, inexplicable things that I feel a need to do as a way of taking care of myself because of where I am in time, and typically place as well. But you can immediately see in an illustration like that how much those dimensions operate not at the level of our information or our knowledge, but at a much deeper level of who we are and the kind of needs that get prompted from those dimensions. And so that's just sort of a way of trying to deal with this question of what is being. And the sense of the reason that I think it is so relevant right now is because over the past 8 years or so, basically since the SDGs came out, the Sustainable Development Goals, which came out in 2015, we see a real change in environmental discourse. The way that people are talking about what we need to do to address the ecological crisis shifts. And it shifts away from a kind of general desire to make change to this language of transformation or transformative change. Now, when you ask people what they mean, what do you mean by transformative change? You get typically one of two possibilities. Either there's really no sense at all, like, I don't know, they're just reaching for a word that sounds cool. And it's a kind of typical language washing that our old approaches weren't working. So we're going to come up with a new thing that we need to do as a way of excusing ourselves from failing prior ambitions. Or it's an intensification of status quo efforts. It's doing more, faster, bigger, and it's about, and this is the part that I find I'm so resistant about in terms of we've got to get clear on what we mean by transformation and transformative change. Because if we mean an intensification of status quo efforts, we're in trouble, right? That's the equivalent of realizing that you're in the car and you're going in the wrong direction, or you haven't packed some crucial thing that you need for the trip. And the response is to step on the gas and go faster. And this is how we're doing a lot of the change work within sustainability. And so the first part of this whole turn towards being, for me, is about saying, we're reaching for the concept of transformation and transformative change. It's everywhere. It's in academic discourse, it's in popular discourse, it's in gray literature. That word has exploded over the past decade. So I believe that there's a kind of collective intuition at work here that's reaching for that term. But then when we see it put into practice, I think we're actually being quite counterproductive around our relationship to transformation. And in fact, the answer is hiding right under our noses all the time. Because if you just ask people very simply, like, don't worry about giving me an elaborate technical definition of what transformative change means. Just ask people if something has transformed, what has happened to it? Has it learned something different? Has it done something different?
Has it
Or has it
disappeared?
become something different?
Or
Right?
has it disappeared?
Or has it vanished altogether? But when I put that to people and I say, you know, those three options, they immediately realize that it's the last one, that we're talking about change at the level of being, that this is about, I mean, to use the academic term, this is about an ontological difference. This is about change, not in what we know or change in what we do, but change in what we are. And so that, you know, if that's true, and we've spent the past 10 years or so recalibrating what the sustainability imperative is, change at the level of being, then suddenly we have we realize why we're not getting anywhere. Because we look at Western society and we say, wow, this is the world of knowledge and action. You guys are great at information and you're great at action, but you're not so great at questions of being. And we're seeing a beautiful illustration of that right now in the West's relationship to artificial intelligence, where we have the capacity to invent and deploy artificial intelligence, this staggering thing. But when it comes time to have even the most modest conversation about what kind of world we want to create as a result of this capacity, we actually declare such a conversation out of bounds. Like we just say, no, you can't even have that conversation. You just have to create the thing, put it out in the world, and see what happens. So we're in this sort of cultural, social, societal condition of being really good at making things and really lousy at making worlds. And that's been okay for a couple of centuries for particular historical and cultural perspectives, and really not okay for other historical and cultural perspectives, as we are increasingly aware of right now. And it's particularly critical right now for everybody, because at this point, we don't need to create change in our knowledge. We don't need to just create change in our action. We need to create change at the level of being. And that's why the sustainability crisis or the climate crisis is such a difficult riddle. And so this is what I describe as the culture gap in the climate crisis. So people are often talking about sort of different gaps in the climate crisis that we need to close. The finance gap, you know, what do we have the level of investment in this transformation that we need, or the policy gap? Are we shaping the policies? You know, is it the knowledge gap? Do we understand enough? And I say all of those things are fine. We need to be working on those things, but the gap that we're ignoring, that is tripping us up constantly in this challenge, is the culture gap. And the culture gap is the difference between the imperative to work at the level of transformation, at the level of being, and a particular society's capacity to do so. Ours is really low. And it's not the case that other cultures, that's just the way humans are. You know, and we like to think in the West, maybe that's just how humans are. It's just harder to create, it's harder to engage with ourselves at the level of being. This is not true. That if we look either at Western culture at different times, or if we look at different cultures in present day, we see all kinds of active capacity to work at the level of being. And the simplest illustration of this is in the place of rituals in our culture versus other cultures. That the West has lost many of its explicit collective ritual practices. And I take this to be a clear illustration of what I'm talking about, and of the presence of the culture gap. So I'm on my way to talking about symbolic infrastructure, I assure you,
It's a good
and
preface.
our
Thank you.
if you're trying to talk to people about, oh, this is, sustainability is about creating change at the level of being, most people just like, they just have no idea what you're talking about. Which is funny because we can talk about well-being all the time. We're really good at talking about well-being, but if to talk about being is like you feel like you must have wandered into a philosophy seminar and you've got to get out of there. And you think, okay, so we've got this sort of concept that we need to be able to engage with, and yet we can't. And then I learned something from one of our colleagues in the Scale Adventure, Claude. This was from Kendra Fanconi, who loved to ask people, and we did this in one of our workshops, tell me about a transformative encounter that you had with art. Tell me about a time when, as a result of a piece of art that you experienced, a play that you saw, or an exhibit that came out, or an album that was released, or a movie that you went to see, where you became a different person, or the world became a different place. And what I have found in asking people that basic question is that everyone has an answer, right? Everybody has a very rich answer to that question. And so suddenly, this sort of obscure idea of transformation and questions of being that are like, I have no idea what it becomes immediate and it becomes biographical. Everybody can talk about transformation. Everybody can relate to themselves at the level of being. And it seems that the easiest way for us to do so is through our relationship with the arts. So this is sort of pointing us in a really significant direction, that the arts have this being relationship with ourselves. They relate to us at the level of meaning and identity and value, all those deep things that we were talking about a moment ago, that art is a kind of interface with that aspect of ourselves. And so then you look at, okay, we're trying to close the culture gap. That's what we're after here. We're trying to respond to the imperative to work at the level of being. And we're trying to respond to the social condition that we're in, where we're not set up as a collective to do that very well, but we have clearly this last ember that is still glowing. And that is our relationship with the arts. And so then I turn to what typically happens, and this is something that you know well, I've been banging my head against this for so long, is that then we see this amazing collective intuition where we've watched in all these different complex problems over the past 20 years or so, we've seen this turn to the arts. This is not just in sustainability and climate. This is also in mental health and justice and leadership and all these different sort of complex challenges. We have this faith that the arts have some kind of role to play. And my argument is that we are intuiting the ability of art to work at the level of being, to engage with transformative change in the way that I've described. But what happens is we live in a culture that is so structured around problem solving at the level of information and knowledge that as soon as we think, okay, yes, of course, art has something really important to do with this, we then immediately, instead of allowing the arts to pull climate discourse into the realm of being, climate discourse pulls art into the realm of knowing. And it becomes a tool for knowing rather than something that allows us to start to engage with ourselves at the level of being. And this is the sort of terrible irony that I find so heartbreaking and so deeply dug in with the way that our our society solves problems and the desire of the arts to be useful and to be in a kind of problem solving mode that we don't recognize clearly enough the nature of the problem within the climate crisis. Can you work at the level of being individually and collectively? And we don't recognize explicitly enough the capacity of the arts to do that. And so instead, we just become a kind of channel of information. So I've been trying to find the concepts and the language that really clearly advertises what is at stake in the problem we can't solve, the reason we can't solve it, and the unique thing that the arts offer. And this is where I've come up with this idea of symbolic infrastructure. I'm purposefully using sort of engineering sounding language as a way of both being a little bit cheeky and ironic, and yet at the same time being insistent that this aspect that might sound sort of, airy-fairy and artsy to you is actually part of the machinery you need to put in place if you want to solve this problem. And so we look at the different kinds of infrastructure that we are trying to construct as part of this transformation out of ecological spiraling and the climate crisis. The financial infrastructure that we need to put the investment in place, the knowledge infrastructure we need to build in order to transform our understandings, the civic infrastructure we need in order to transform our settlements and our cities, and the kind of work that's happening in adaptation. And then the symbolic infrastructure, the infrastructure we need to create in order to transform our meanings and our identities and our values and our beliefs and our sense of time and place in order to move from one world into a totally different world. And I think I try not to be too hyperbolic with this, but I think it's fair to say that asking somebody to move from one world to a completely different world without providing them with the symbolic infrastructure they'd need to walk from one place to another has been tantamount to standing people on one side of the Grand Canyon and yelling jump as loud as we can, and then shaming them for not doing so. And that's been a large part of the kind of sustainability legacy, that we have been insisting on a change at the level of being while providing none of the infrastructure, the machinery, the apparatus to go on that change. And so that's why I'm trying to put this as clearly and concretely as we can to say, it's not the only thing, but one of the best things for doing that in our world right now is the arts. And so if we don't take that on, and instead we end up providing people with information about excess CO2 or something, or cultural or climate policy, we're abandoning the unique thing that only the arts can do in favor of a kind of futile, limited thing that everyone is doing with pamphlets and brochures all over the place.
And that was a long statement. Thank you. The arts, of course, are not monolithic. They are very broad. They're very diversified. Some people don't use the word art, but I think I know what you mean. You're talking about human expression, human creative expression that we've sort of categorized as art, but it's that energy, that impulse to reflect and to bring perspectives and to literally imagine new worlds. I hear you when you say, I have a daily Qigong practice where I'm trying to get out of my thoughts and into feeling my body, and it's not that Buddhism does something similar, and what you're talking about is not unlike that change. So it's not a new idea, right? It's just we're in a pickle right now with so much energy and technology that we haven't thought through, we haven't felt through, and this world has ended. The world as we know it has come to an end. The abuse and the extraction and the colonialism can't continue. The world just can't sustain it. And what you're saying, I think, is that art has always played a role, but needs to step up a bit further in the sense that it has capacity, or at least it has potential, to contribute to humanity. But how do artists do that, David? They're struggling to make a living, and they're, caught in the system. They're part of modernity, right? And they like it too. I do. I love the technology that allows us to speak today. So, speaking to your peers, artists, without being didactic and do this, do that, what is it that they could do differently, at least on the short term, to move towards that transformative being that you talk about?
I mean, the first thing that I think is so important is to realize that, let's use more neoliberal language just to be cheeky, but your unique value proposition, the thing that arts do better than anything else, is what is needed. So don't abandon your capacity to engage with experience and help others engage with experience through the aesthetic, through lines and shapes and patterns and textures and rhythms and harmonies. Those dimensions seem to be the elements that engage not at the level of information and knowledge, but at a deeper level, at the level of meaning. And there's wonderful books that have explained that for me, and that may be helpful in shaping folks' approach to that. But the basic starting point for this is to think, I'm an artist, I want to be useful. What do I do? What you do as an artist is crucial, is crucial. Do not abandon that for a desire to serve a kind of utilitarian purpose of, I'm going to make sure people know more. The faith in knowing more is the siren song of our society that constantly sees us leaping off of the vessel that can carry us through this, with this belief that we can suddenly transform society because we can provide information. Decorating climate policy with the arts is not transformative. What you know how to do as an artist is so fundamentally important. I think that's, if I have only one thing to be really pedantic and didactic about, it's that. It's that the lure of thinking you can help educate or inform or change the knowledge of is a fool's errand. Don't do it. So whenever I'm working with climate artists, I say, okay, our first rule is that everyone's going to walk out of here having learned nothing. We don't want anybody to, so we disabuse ourselves of the idea that our job is to educate. Our job is not to educate. Stay with your practice. Engage. You are the only people left that can engage with the world at the level of being. I don't actually think they're the only people left, but it's such a virtue that we often abandon when we try and be useful. So you have the most essential role to play, and you have already been trained in saving the world through your artistic practice. So that's sort of, I think, the first thing that I think we need to do. I have tried to put this in terms of these three modes idea, not because I want to be pedantic about that, but because I just was so heartbroken at watching decades of really brilliant, talented artists drift back into a faith that if they provide the knowledge, the information, that the world will change. And we have all the academic research we need. It's called the information deficit model of behavior change. The idea that if I provide new information, you'll generate new knowledge, new values, and new behavior. It doesn't work. We know that it doesn't work, and yet it keeps tempting us into its promise. And I have two things to say about the information deficit model. The first is a kind of joke in a way that I often tell. The best proof that the information deficit model doesn't work is to notice that we've spent 50 years providing ourselves with the information that the information deficit model doesn't work, and we keep on using it anyway. That we're stuck in this debilitating circumstance with this. But the other, that's sort of the, that's a kind of mocking of our relationship to the information deficit model. The other problem with this is actually, I think we're stuck using the information deficit model because our culture largely doesn't know how to do anything else. That's all we've got. You look around, we are knowledge and information producers. All of our universities, look at the buildup of academic institutions and the collapse of institutions that are not that produce some other kind of thing. The fact that it's so hard to make a living as an artist right now is in many ways a testament to the fact that we don't live in a being focused society. And so trying to find ways to address the kind of practical dimension of your question is a lot of the focus of my work at the Metcalf Foundation. How do we make it possible for the arts to fill this vital role that they have to play purely from a kind of socioeconomic perspective?
And without telling artists which issue to address specifically, because I had a conversation with Bob Sermon, a former director of the council, about this a few weeks ago in Toronto, and he said more or less what you're saying is that artists need to be empowered to do what they do, and not necessarily be told what to do, but to work with others and on issues that they feel and they want to express. And it's hard to miss the climate emergency because it's all around us, but there are other sources of the climate emergency that one has to look at in terms of decolonization and other complex issues. And the arts, this is something you've been consistent, David, in saying, is that the arts are comfortable in those complexities. They are able to navigate those waters. And so I think we need more art, but not necessarily, as you say, art that's trying to wave a banner of alarm or awareness. I mean, you can do that if it makes you feel good. It might wake some people up, but more at a much more deep level, it's about the experience of the arts and as a process also of engagement. It's ongoing. Like I have works of art that just stay with me. They keep nourishing me. It's not like I went one time and it ended. It's just there. It entered my DNA, and I'm enriched by artistic experience all the time. And I think people can create their own experiences and experience the work of others. The whole issue of professionalism, we'll talk about another time, we've created a professional sector of the arts, and that's the arts. Well, it's actually, in my mind, not true. There's arts everywhere. Some are better at it. Some are trained. But anyway, we've been talking for a while here, David. I want to wrap up soon. I'm sure there's more we can talk about, but did you want to jump in with something new, or shall I ask my last question?
Well, no, I will just riff on that. I agree so much that really what's of value is not preserving the official institutional landscape. What we cannot live without is a culture that knows how to engage with itself at the level of the aesthetic. And that is not the exclusive province of our fancy arts institutions. And so figuring out how to nurture that capacity and not necessarily the institutionalization of it, although maybe institutionalizing it in many ways is important to strengthening that capacity. We are not engaged with that riddle nearly enough. But I agree so much with your point about the fact that that the kind of capital A arts sector may not be putting a sufficient boundary around what we're really talking about when we're thinking about the value of the arts.
And dialogue helps, I think your paper, people are starting to comment on it. I invite people to just express themselves about how they react, how they respond, how they can contribute to the issues that are being raised by artists. And again, it's not a new thing, but because of the circumstance of what's called the poly crisis, the combination and that horrible feeding of each of the crises that we're living are truly terrifying. And part of it is staying calm, right? And your paper doesn't push the panic button. It proposes, it gives insight, it moves us into a realm of feeling and being that I think we need. So two things. One is at the beginning, we talked a bit about impact investment, just because that's what you're working on now. And I find that intriguing for artists to hear about that, which is how is that unfolding in your work at Metcalf Foundation and others? Because that seems to be very promising to integrate. There's an episode coming up on or I've already published it on social innovation, and so social innovators are really interested in art. So what's the story with impact investment in the arts?
Sure. So this, I think, what we're looking at are increasing demands on the state to deliver public goods and a decreasing capacity of the state to do so. And so much of this has to do with an inadequate taxation system. So I just want to start a conversation on impact investing with the proviso that the right thing to do would be to fix the tax system and to make sure that we are providing the state with the resources it needs to provide the demands that we are also placing on it, that we're seeing the inability of the state to deliver on healthcare, on education, on climate response, on the arts, etc., on basic infrastructure, because we live in a system that allows wealth to accrue into the hands of a small number of private individuals. This is just not okay. It's not rocket science. It's not a riddle what's going on. It's very obvious. And short of being able to deal with that issue, impact investing is a kind of backdoor response to redistributing the accumulation of private wealth in service of the public good. So that's sort of why I'm very interested in it. And we're seeing this is not a sort of small amount of money. This is like estimates are hard to really nail down, but $17 trillion is the number that people give on the size of the capital pool worldwide ready to start delivering on this kind of investment in the public good. So it's a huge amount of money, and we see education and healthcare and sustainability and climate and clean tech and all of these different initiatives moving to be able to work with impact investing. And we see, for the most part, cultural sectors completely left behind, that they simply do not know how to move into the stream of resource flows that are moving through this basic approach of what gets called impact investing worldwide, or what we call social finance in Canada. And so I got very interested in this because for two reasons, really. First of all, just the question of how do we find the resources to do the work that we need to do? And secondly, because I run a small cultural nonprofit that has worked with debt financing on two separate occasions. And maybe it's important to say that impact investing and social finance, it means taking out loans, but very specific loans that are tailored to accomplishing a particular good. But that nonetheless, it's repayable finance. And the cultural sector, of course, is typically used to grants, money that it doesn't have to pay back.
And
And
donations.
I'm
Right?
very, what's that?
And donations.
And donations and other kind of non-repayable contributions. Exactly. So what I did for a couple of reasons, really mainly because I didn't know I wasn't supposed to, is that I worked with debt financing. I worked with a project where I had to pay the money back at the end of doing a project. And I was very struck by the differences that made in how I worked, because I couldn't avail of a kind of what I think of as a sort of modernist aesthetic where I could say, I'm going to produce the truth of my artistic vision, the public be damned. I had to say, this work needs to matter to people. People need to care about and be positively impacted by what we're doing enough that we can realize the value of that in a commercial transaction in order to pay this money back. And that use of debt actually changed so much of how I operated as an artist. I became more community engaged. I became more concerned that I was actually meeting a need that people had and not a need that I thought they should have, which is, I think, a big difference in how we work as artists. Typically, we say, I'm going to create this art, and if people don't know they need it, that's their problem. That needs to be our problem now. We've spent too long being that kind of art sector. We need to think very much in terms of how do I do something that really meets the cultural needs of the people I say I'm serving? And repayable finance, not as a replacement for grants whatsoever, but as a thread that you weave into the tapestry of your resources, forces you to turn outward in a way that I think is very good for all the things that we've been talking about on this episode so far. In terms of actually saying, so when I program now the organization that I run, Camber Arts in Western Newfoundland, tiny organization in a very remote part of the world, which I think is a testament to the fact that this doesn't need to be a big urban thing. When I program, I'm the artistic director. I don't program with a sense of what is my artistic vision for this company. And that is the KPI of an artistic director. That's what you get asked when you're being interviewed for an artistic director job. What is your artistic vision for this company? And then you get chosen based on having like the most compelling answer to that question. I have completely thrown that question out. I do not say, what is my artistic vision for this company this season? I program with a very different question. How is this meeting the cultural needs of this community? And that change in orientation that we're seeing take place, we're not the only organization that's starting to think that way. A lot of different folks have been writing about this, and I would recommend Manifesto for Now, that has done a really nice piece on the change from artist-centered programming to audience-centered programming. I see what I'm doing as a version of that. That basic instinct emerged from our use of a small amount of debt financing as part of what we do. And so I don't just turn to the idea of impact investing for the cultural sector with the idea that here's a little bit of limited capital for a very limited number of users to use in a very limited set of purposes. I see it as a real capacity building initiative. It's how we get our financial management in place. It's how we get our commercial skills and our entrepreneurial instincts sharpened to the point that they need to be. It's how we get way more community engaged. And most importantly, it's how we start to build an impact practice. It's how we start to account for the good that we are delivering in the world. And we need to get better at accounting for that good because as we want to stand amongst the social innovators and start to move around the different public benefit sectors, health and education and environment as the sort of classic examples, we need to become much more explicit and articulate about what public good do we actually deliver. And we need to make sure that we're actually delivering that public good, that this is not just advocacy, that we're actually delivering that public good. And where we're not delivering it, we need to be able to develop the data to say, how are we missing the boat here? And optimize, rebuild that practice so that we are delivering that public good. And so I see a huge amount of promise in impact investing, not just in terms of its resource potential, but also in terms of its transformative potential for the sector. Again, not as a replacement for grants, but as something we
Yeah.
weave into a larger granting economy.
And as you spoke, I can't help but think about specific situations, community, a town that was burnt like Lytton in British Columbia and other places. And if they were to turn to artists and say, I'm in need, what would the artist do, right? And those are very concrete situations where when you ask the question, you might not, I don't know what the answer would be, but you need to ask that question. And you're really talking about relations, right? You're connecting relations and reciprocity and all those things that aren't new either, but we've kind of fallen into a rabbit hole of me, myself, and I-ish type behavior because that's the way we were taught. That's the way that the world is. But we can change that world. And I think I really like the idea of asking the question to audiences, what do you need? What would you like? How that there's community engaged arts. There's all kinds of art forms that already they just need like a little extension. They need a bridge from out of the theater into the community, out of the gallery. And that's not that hard to do because artists are, I'm sure, interested in connecting further. Anyway, David, we've been speaking for about an hour now, and I'll give our listeners a break. I asked guests what they're reading or if they have, you alluded to a couple of publications. What would you suggest people, first of all, what excites you right these days in your readings and listenings, and what do you recommend?
We've been sort of talking a lot about, well, what is, mode three climate art? What is the climate art that really illustrates the aesthetic being put to work? And one of the ones that I find really powerful is the writing of Richard Powers in the US, American novelist, who's got a few different books about the ecological crisis, and his ability to put this in a really aesthetic framing, I find illustrative of what I'm talking about. So that's probably, the best example of that I can think, although there are many that certainly enchant. Yeah, I talked about sort of this sense of art as a kind of paying attention to the world in terms of the aesthetic, and that comes from a Canadian poet named Don Mackay, who's got a book called Vis-a-Vis, and it is a brilliant book around what he describes as poetic attention and the way in which an artistic form of attention to the world has a very unique quality to it. So I would recommend Don's book Vis-a-Vis as a fabulous, and it's not a long and dense read. It's nonfiction, but it's incredibly enriching. So that would be my other recommendation on the list.
Mhm. Well, let's conclude there. Thank you so much for this second conversation. Lot to work through, but it's positive, David. I think it's you're opening our ability to experience what's already there. We just don't know that it's there. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. That in many ways, yeah, we have what we need to deal with this crisis. We know how to work at the level of being. We know how to do transformative change. We do it all the time. We just have to make that, as you said, it's just like that little step that we have to make in terms of applying this capacity to this crisis in a way that has the kind of impact we desperately need right now.